Simon, can you just quickly give an overview of what kind of projects you and the team of project leaders that you manage, what kind of projects are you involved with? Where does that fit into GSK's methods?
The site is a new product introduction site within the GSK network. The site itself manages the phase 3 clinical material manufacture, but then we'll go on to manufacture the commercial scale product and commercialize that product. So we'll go through product and process validation qualification activities, moving in through to first launch into major markets. So, and very much our activity, as you mentioned, is linked to that new product introduction industrialization. And I've got a team of 5 project managers who will work those project plans and move that through from initial kickoff on site right through to PAI approval and first launch into commercial markets.
So is that taking a new drug, in effect, from the sort of quantities that can be made almost at lab scale or semi-technical scale to the sorts of scale and methods that you would use as and when the drug is proven and fully on the market?
Yeah, correct. And typically we're handling high value, low volume products. So we typically up to kind of 100 to 200 litre batch size.
Just over a year ago, you came across this method of critical chain as a student on our master's programme at Birmingham. What was it about critical chain that made you think, that's interesting, that maybe tick some boxes, I'll give it a go?
Yeah, we've, like you say, and it was part of the course that we covered, and it's quite interesting actually, because we over the last 2 or 3 years have been very successful in delivering NPI. So it wasn't a case of starting from a point of failure. We've started from a point of successful delivery of a number of NPIs over several years, but we'd started to see that delivery was becoming more difficult, and we were finding it harder, if you like, to deliver the NPIs to the timelines that we were expected to deliver them to. And reading some of the principles and theory behind critical chain project management really resonated, I guess, with myself in terms of solving some of those problems that we were encountering on a day-to-day basis, really. And it seemed like a way to both simplify the process, but make the process of project delivery more visible and more collaborative in terms of the ways of working, and seemed to, certainly at a theoretical level, solve a lot of the problems that we were seeing on a day-to-day basis at a practical level on site. So really at that point then thought, look, this is something probably to look into a bit more and see if it offers some real practical opportunities to improve our project delivery processes at the Barnard Castle site.
And I think for context, your need wasn't necessarily to do things faster, either because of what you said, you'd been hit at the expected delivery dates already, albeit, if I understand correctly, sometimes with quite a bit of student syndrome, long hours, weekend working, and quite a lot of hassle and stress and excitement.
Yes.
But also for context, I think it's worthwhile letting people know that the work that you do on the Barnard Castle site has to fit in within a much wider programme of new product introduction. There's lots of other work and project activity going on in parallel. And therefore, if you did your bit 3 months earlier, it wouldn't actually help the overall project, because the bit you're looking at is just part of a much larger beast.
Correct. Yeah. So
is that correct as a simplification?
It is, Ian. Yeah. So we obviously form a part of that end-to-end delivery process, and as people probably understand, within a large multinational pharmaceutical company, there'll be commitments and strategies in terms of delivery timelines for particular assets. So yes, we work within a number of fixed milestones, if you like, that form part of a wider delivery program for each of those NPI projects. So absolutely, we didn't necessarily need to do things a lot faster, although saying that, we obviously, like all companies, there's a level of pressure to do things faster, to accelerate our delivery, to be first to market, and that pressure then can become a level of urgency to shorten lead time. So we do see an element of that, but absolutely, I think to a large extent, our milestones are fixed. And one of the interesting things, I guess, that leads to, Ian, is that we then thought, can CCPM be applied to an operating model of a project plan that's got fixed milestones? Yeah.
We'll come on to the results that you've seen within your remit and maybe hopefully talk about the wider potential, what you might call big bucks benefit to companies like GSK, which is if the success that you've seen early signs of is representative and can be replicated elsewhere, then the impact could be much more significant, but only if the whole of the program gets similar gains and improvements that you've seen. Is that right? So you came across this idea, thought that's interesting. What did you next do? Because I'm reminded of John Cotter's term, the change management guru, about getting a guiding coalition. So I think one of the first things that you did was, there's an interesting idea. How do I get support to give that a go on something so much under the spotlight, like introducing potentially the next pharmaceutical blockbuster?
Yeah.
So what steps did you go through to get support to give this crazy sounding idea a go?
Yeah, so it was interesting actually, Ian, because, as we've mentioned earlier, we weren't in a position where we were failing to deliver. Quite the reverse. We had a good track record of delivery. So I thought this may be a hard sell, really. I was thinking I'm going to be bringing a new process into a site where we've already got a lot of success, and I might get a lot of pushback. So I did a bit more research into the topic, pulled together some information, and took that to our site leadership team and site director. And it was one of those where you think, am I going to go in and get shot down in flames here because we're really already good at what we do? But actually, quite the reverse. So I took a summary of the theories as you talked about around multitasking, student syndrome, Parkinson's law, etc., and presented to this site leadership team in one of our monthly governance meetings. And it was probably one of the first site leadership teams I'd been in where everybody agreed that it was the right thing to do. So I was sitting there thinking, look, I'm going to get loads of pushback, and there's going to be a lot of challenge here because there's often an aversion to change, especially if you're being successful. But taking that to the senior leadership team and sharing that the principles of the approach, there was a real consensus that it made an awful lot of sense. And to the extent of why haven't we done this before? Why haven't we looked at this before? As well as going in to discuss the theory and the principles behind critical chain, I was also in that meeting to request support to perform a pilot, and to request some money to support that pilot. So what we wanted to do was bring in a consultancy to support our initial implementation. And obviously there was a cost to that, but again, amazingly, we got unanimous support and approval for that on the spot, and they basically said, "Yep, just do it, go ahead, let's trial this because all of the principles that you're talking about, we get it," and that was within a 1 hour session with the site leadership team, which was flabbergasting. Really, it was just amazing that there was full 100% consensus. So I walked out that room with full support of the site leadership team and also the funding to support the kickoff of the pilot program and bringing a management consultancy on CCPM in to support us to do that.
Did you notice particular nerves, or was the timing right, or were there particular topics, or was it just general sense of looking for opportunities to continuously improve performance? What was it you think were the key triggers?
We shared an example where we'd had three work streams running to deliver a particular activity on a project, and actually one of the work streams was a new facility introduction. And what we saw was that there was actually an integration point in those three work streams. Now this had been about 6 to 9 months previously, so it was still quite fresh in people's minds that using our traditional project management approach, those three work streams had been running in parallel, but they came to that integration point, and what we found was one of those work streams was delayed, which meant that the overall project activity as a result of that integration was delayed. And I think that was probably the one thing that was still quite fresh in people's minds. And I used that as part of the presentation to say, I guess, to articulate and visualize how that had occurred using the traditional project management approaches, and how perhaps the critical chain project management approach would have identified that a lot earlier and allowed us to take corrective action a lot earlier in the project plan, and perhaps have avoided that situation. So we used I guess a real past example that had created some noise on the site as perhaps a bit of leverage just to use as a practical example of how CCPM could have perhaps allowed us to avoid that. And we used some of those I guess those behaviours that you mentioned, Ian. So we talked about, you know, the kind of the multitasking. We talked about the kind of the hidden buffers. We talked about some of the issues inherent in traditional project management behaviours, and some of those behaviours for all the right reasons, right? And I know we've talked about it before, Ian, in terms of when, you know, you're working on a very busy manufacturing site and people have multiple priorities. People are inevitably in a position where they have to multitask. They have to try and put contingency and buffer into their day-to-day activities. You know, they're trying to do that for all the right reasons. But unfortunately, where that drives you to is the potential to effectively overrun quite significantly on project activities. So we talked about all of that with the site leadership team, and the kind of, you know, as I say, recognise and realise that quite quickly. And as soon as we gave that potential option that, you know, really removes some of those behaviours or perhaps manages those behaviours better, I think that was then seen as something we really wanted to explore further to see if that could give us real benefits in terms of project management, control and delivery.
That's interesting, because you sometimes hear a concern that approach to describing or even selling critical chain can come over as somewhat negative and critical and blame allocation. You know, the problem is you're task switching too often. The problem is you're hiding all this buffer from me. And that can be seen quite aggressive. So it sounds like, firstly, at least at the site leadership team level, you didn't get any defensiveness. You got nodding heads saying, yep, I recognise that. That seems a reasonable analysis of our situation.
It does, Ian.
Move to the next stage. You've got the okay from senior leadership team. Sort of, now what? Because if anything, that sort of perceived criticism and allocating of blame in that multitasking, Parkinson's law, student syndrome description of critical chain is more applicable to the project teams. So did that arise when you started the process of implementing it on your two pilot projects that you'd chosen? Maybe it wasn't an issue, maybe it was. If it was, how did you overcome it? So can you talk us through the process of, once you got the green light, what did you do next to actually make a start?
Well, we ran a large workshop. Maris Consulting supported us in terms of the implementation, and Maris came in and helped us and facilitated a large workshop where we brought the whole project team together. So we brought everyone together in a two.
Was that from your one pilot or two pilots?
From one pilot. So the first pilot project, yeah, and we brought them into a 2-day workshop where we talked through all of the principles. We talked through some of the challenges that project teams have in terms of project delivery. We talked about, you know, the demand, the business demand sometimes to multitask, and people's desires to meet project timelines and milestones, and therefore they will, you know, put buffer into activities and tasks almost inherently to achieve what they feel they're committing to in terms of task timings. So we very much spent 2 days in depth talking through both the principles of CCPM, but probably more importantly, the relationship and behaviours of project teams and how the CCPM approach would be applied on site and also not applied. So it was very much a discussion that was non-critical. It was a discussion and workshop that really, you know, allowed the team to share its concerns and its issues with project delivery on a day-to-day basis. And I think that really built a trust and rapport with the team ahead of the initial implementation, which meant that it was a much easier sell in a way into the project team and it felt a lot more collaborative as we kicked off. Now, interestingly, when we initiated the second pilot project, we didn't do that 2-day workshop. So we did, I think it was, a couple of hours of internal training with the team. And I think we had about an hour of Maris's time as well. And it was very interesting. The feedback was it took longer to gain that commitment and trust from the team. And it took them longer to go through that change process of the traditional project management approach that we had been using to the critical chain process. But nevertheless, we did still achieve that end goal, but it just took us longer to, I guess, get the team fully on board. And I guess very much, I think that the key to this is this, the focus durations and pessimistic or worst case duration discussions. And I think we had a lot of nervousness at the start of the project that there'd be a lot of pushback or a lot of suspicion from the project teams when we went through that process. However, as I mentioned, as we went through that 2-day workshop and went then into the initial sort of replanning activities, we got a lot of support and adoption by the project team to that approach, and very little resistance and pushback. So they were very willing to talk about focus durations and worst case durations, because we'd had a lot of conversation about what was causing issues in their day to day. So we had a level of honesty, I guess, within the project team, and then that drove that very easily into having those conversations about focus durations, worst case durations, and what was causing those potential issues between those focus durations and worst case durations.
Those 2-day workshops, they were mixed. So you took the whole team through the ideas of critical chain, the principles,
Correct.
the methodology as an all hands training.
Correct.
And then you used the team from Maris to help you set up the particular software you were using, didn't you? So it was not a 2-day training program. It was a day of that. And then you had some help setting up the particular software and translating your old plan to a new one.
Yeah.
With the second pilot, did you shortcut both of those? Was it a shortcutting that you did, and you realised it took longer, or did you?
We took less. We took less time, I think. So overall, we had a 3-month contract with Maris to support the initiation of the pilot. We as we went through the first project, we were assessing that as we went in terms of ease of implementation and that implementation roadmap, if you like. I think the implementation of the second project, the only reflection was that we should have done more of that upfront work in terms of collaboratively with the project team. I think as we went into implementation phase, however, although it took slightly longer to go through that kind of change curve for the team, I think the actual mechanics of the CCPM process was much easier, much faster to implement the second time around. So we've now implemented it for a third project, but what we did for that third project was we invested more time at the front end to support that kind of conditioning, if you like, of the project team, that awareness for the project team. But the implementation has been even faster on the third project. So because we really understand the mechanics of the process now. So kind of what we've found is just we've got to ensure that we do that front end conditioning piece well, and then it really accelerates into the implementation process.
And things that are a generic lesson from projects anyway.
Correct. Yeah.
The amount of preparation you do helps you, and rushing into execution often costs you.
But we found the software to be very easy to use, by the way, Ian. So I mean, we adopted the ProChain software, and as I mentioned, we've got an aligned planner who works with our project managers, project leaders, and he's become the subject matter expert for that software, which links to Microsoft Project anyway. So it's quite intuitive in terms of its usage, and we didn't find any difficulties with the integration of the software and the generation of the fever charts and the critical chain. We found it relatively straightforward.
That was my observation there with your third pilot, because it seems you've got two groups of people with the likes of your planning team and yourself and the management team. It's in effect the third go round.
Correct.
So there's the learning curve has been got up, which is probably why it was faster.
Yes.
But you highlight what seems to me an important point, that many of the members of the particular third project, it will be their first time.
Yeah.
And for them, you need to allow that sort of absorption, ability to ask
Correct.
questions that you got from that one day
Yeah,
kickoff. Is that a reasonable
it is,
summary?
Ian. Yeah, yeah.
Can you share some of the results that you've seen, having now run it at different stages on 3 different pilots over? I think you kicked off by the time the conference goes out about a year. It was March, April, wasn't
Correct.
it, when you first
Yeah.
kicked off in 2022? So, what are the sort of key headline results that you've seen?
I think the really big benefit that we've seen, Ian, is the visibility of the project in terms of project status that the fever charts give us. So, and the project team and key stakeholders have said the same thing, that the fever chart really provides a view on project progress that perhaps we hadn't seen before. So, traditional project management approach that we were using, as we mentioned previously, was between kind of fixed milestones. So we were very much almost anticipating the delivery of a milestone, and felt relief when we hit that milestone. And sometimes, like you say, it would be maybe days prior to the milestone or even hours prior to the milestone that you'd still be doing activities to hit that milestone. With critical chain, what we found was that the ways of working in the fever chart gave us that information much more frequently, and probably this is one of the other benefits that we saw, was the cadence of the process. So we historically had a monthly project meeting process, and with critical chain we moved that to a weekly, well, twice weekly process. So we'd meet on a Monday to set the requirements for that week, the task list for that week, and bring the team together to review that and agree those deliverables with the team. And then on a Friday, we come back together to look at what's been delivered during that week. And if it hadn't been delivered, how much more time the team needed to do that delivery, and then ask them what help they needed. So every week, then we would get a fever chart that showed the progress on the project, and that's really helped the project team in terms of both their visibility on the project, but both motivationally to understand how they're contributing and progressing the project. What we also found was that the key stakeholders involved in the project became much more confident in the project delivery, which was an interesting byproduct of introducing CCPM, I think, because historically there was always a nervousness, right, about project delivery, because there was nothing that indicated whether we were on track or not, apart from a project manager saying, I think we're on track, or I think we're not on track. What we ended up with CCPM was a very data-driven view of the project progress, but also a view of how much of that aggregated buffer that we'd utilized or we'd burnt through. So that gave the stakeholders much more confidence in the project delivery process and the progress on the project. But not only that, it also focused their discussions with regards to what help we needed on the project. Because if we started to see from the fever chart that the project was going off track, it was a much more focused discussion then to say, well, what do you need to get it back on track? And because you're having those conversations much more proactively and much earlier in the project, the conversations were much more positive and collaborative. I think in the past, what we'd probably have had is some nervous stakeholders going, hold on a sec, are we really going to hit this milestone? And often what that had driven was a level of over-management or micromanagement of the project team, which is never useful and is often counterproductive. What we've found is that actually the stakeholders are less hands-on because they're more confident in the project, but also they're more confident that if the project is going to go off track, that they're going to know about that earlier, and they're going to know why, so they can give the focused help that the project needs. So we've actually built some significantly better relationships with the project stakeholders, which was certainly something we weren't aware of at the start of the pilot was going to happen. And it's been a very, very positive byproduct of that, I think.
The way you described it to me was you flipped from that vicious cycle of micromanagement and worry to a more virtuous cycle, so that when senior stakeholders are hands-on, it's well enough in advance and it's with a problem-solving mentality.
Correct.
As opposed to, who do I beat this time?
Yeah, I guess the other really positive aspect that we've seen, which again we hadn't necessarily considered, is that bringing the project team together more frequently, so bringing them together every week on a Monday and a Friday, has driven a much more cohesive, collaborative project team who actually are in conversation on a much more regular basis, and are starting to problem solve for the team rather than for the individual. So often, because of the way organizationally we're structured, that, it's a large site where there's a lot of functions. People are often working within their own functions and can be siloed, 1 month to the next. On the previous project meeting process that we had, which was a monthly process, now we're bringing them together twice a week, even though that's just for a short period. It's just for 30 minutes on a Monday, 30 minutes on a Friday. What we started to see is that collaboration and cooperation is driving motivation within the team to work to the project, to work for the team rather than for the individual. And we're actually seeing informal problem solving starting to happen within those Monday and Friday meetings, which is avoiding some of the larger problems that perhaps we would have had in the past when that wasn't occurring.
That's a good observation, and it mirrors one that I heard quite a few years ago about critical chain, albeit in the context of portfolio management. So a larger organisation, a team of project managers, that I was told simply because of the sharing of the portfolio fever chart. Once that team collaboration had improved, almost as a spin-off from the methodology, then what they were finding is, without prompting, projects that were well in the green were proactively offering resources and other help to the projects that were in the red well in advance. So it seems quite a common theme that you've observed there, and very much one that adds to improve project performance. One of the final questions, Simon, just in case everybody thinks that everything in the garden is rosy, you were telling me of some of the difficulties some of the team members are having. Very much highlight that difficulty of resources being pulled in all sorts of directions, and the fact that individual projects cannot always manage that unilaterally themselves. Do you have any tips and tricks that you've learned over the past 12 months for managing those limited resources who are shared by lots of projects and lots of day-to-day operations that you still need to focus and finish on your individual project?
Yeah, I think the big one for us, Ian, is that a number of our activities are data driven and transactional, which drives the input of a lot of different functions sequentially to deliver a group of activities to complete a task. Because as I mentioned, the potential for people to be in different functions and siloed, what we were finding was that there'd be a conflict or demand from potentially other projects, but also from the day-to-day operations, because a number of these people work within functions that are non-dedicated, so they're not dedicated to the project. What we've seen is, because we're only at pilot scale, I guess, of 2 or 3 projects using this process, that although we're driving those principles and practices within those 3 projects, there's a lot of kind of, I guess, headwinds, if you like, or conflicts across the site, which may then interfere and interrupt with the principles and practices that we've introduced for CCPM. But what this has allowed us to do is, when we're seeing that there's a multifunctional transactional activity within a project that needs a number of different participants, it's allowed us to then very quickly identify that we can bring them together in a collaborative forum. So ring fence or agree some time within their diaries to bring all of those people together in one room, and do those transactions much faster sequentially together in a room, rather than doing that in a very siloed way. Because we've had the Monday, Friday meetings, it's made it much more visible when there's that sort of multifunctional transactional activity that's going to occur. It gives us that kind of prior warning to say, well, hold on a sec, either you bring those people together and do that separately as a group and do this much faster and more efficiently, or leave it siloed and transactional, and you know for a fact you'll be late. So what it's allowed us to do is perhaps be more transparent and identify when we need to perhaps bring people out of their normal day-to-day operations and protect them by putting them in a room together to achieve something much faster than they would have done if we hadn't done that. So that's certainly one of the things that we've seen as a big benefit. But again, I think it's, because critical chain makes that workload very visible, and the weekly meetings give you that cadence where you're reviewing the work requirements on a much more frequent basis, it allows it to become very visible very quickly to the project managers, and they can take that proactive action with the team. And because we've started to build that team spirit and that collaboration within the team, we're starting to see people are much more willing to do that, to work together, to work collaboratively, to come out of the day to day for a short period of time to deliver something more quickly, and then go back into their daily activities. And what they're seeing is that's freeing some time up for them as well. So they're, it's reducing the amount of multitasking that they're having to do, because you're kind of sequencing the work more effectively.
Interesting. So it's reduced stress because you've concentrated that work in a meeting.
Correct.
With all the people to do it.
Correct.
Rather than simply passing work from one to another, and it just sits in a backlog and it stares at them and stresses them.
Yeah, so exactly that.
Thank you for sharing just a fraction of the learning and experience and insights that you've gained from your past 12 months having a go with critical change. Simon and I will now be available in the Q&A session, and we look forward to following up the conversation with many of you there.
Thanks, folks, for listening to this. And by all means, any questions you have at the end of this, then feel free. We'll be available, and I'll try and share at least my insights of a pilot in a pharmaceutical company, and hopefully it'll help to inspire you to try it.
Phew. Well, there was a little bit of unplanned activity. Thank you all very much for bearing with us, and hopefully the delay between audio and visual was not too much of a problem. Simon, a couple of questions we've got. Just under 15 minutes remaining. Daniel asks about the relationship between the projects you did and the wider enterprise-wide activities and milestones. And he asked, did all the projects implement critical chain, or just a subset of those that fed into the large enterprise-wide milestones? Do you want to give a bit more background on how that fitted?
Yeah, can do, Ian. Yeah. So we, I guess, currently have a portfolio of about 5 or 6 new product introduction projects at the moment, and our strategy for that was to do a pilot as we mentioned during the session there, introduce it initially for one project and then to scale out from that project, really. So it was to a bit of proof of concept, I guess, on an individual project, and cut our teeth and learn our trade a little bit. And then start to implement that on more projects, which we have done. We have at the moment retained it within new product introduction projects, but there is a desire from our site leadership team to start to scale that into non-NPI projects and site strategy type projects as well. So we're just in the process, really, of trying to pull together some sort of kind of decision tree, if you like, in terms of which projects may be qualified to be supported by CCPM and which may not, and really looking at that on the basis of kind of size, scale, complexity, and scope of the project. Well, I think you're frozen there, Ian. A few more technical gremlins going on by the looks of it.
There we go. I'll switch it on off and on again.
You're back again. Oh, yeah, you froze there for a sec.
Yeah. What are your and GSK's plans for continuing with the pilots now? I think when we made the recording, you'd started your third new product introduction.
Yeah. So we've
critical chain.
Yeah, we brought in an additional planner. At the moment, we're using, as I mentioned, the ProChain software. It does drive a level of planner resource to support the kind of plan updates and the development of the weekly task lists, etc. We are assessing other kind of platforms like the ProChain Fusion, which would give us more of a kind of a web-based interactive process to allow direct data entry. But at this stage, still working on the planner-based process. So we brought in a second planner just to relieve some of the resource constraints there, to allow us to then span that out into other NPI projects. So the plan is by kind of middle of this year to have all of the NPI projects on Critical Chain. So there's a further 2 projects initiating now, and a further project to initiate in the next sort of 4 to 6 weeks. So by mid-year, we should have all of the NPI projects on Critical Chain, and then it's an assessment as to which other projects, which non-NPI projects, will then transition onto CCPM as well.
Mm-hmm. And then GSK is obviously a very large organisation, and your remit is within the particular Barnard Castle site in northeast England. What sort of discussions or interests have you had from elsewhere, or is it like many large groups that everyone keeps to themselves?
No, that we have publicised some of the successes that we've had with Critical Chain in our kind of social networking platforms within GSK. So there has been interest from several sites in terms of the Critical Chain principles, and we've shared this with our project community of practice as well. So at the moment, I guess we're sharing information. As yet, we haven't seen another site implemented, but I'm guessing it's probably a timing thing, to be honest. And we continue to share the successes that we're seeing with the Critical Chain principles with our senior leadership, both on-site and off-site. So central leadership and senior leadership coming to site for visits. We're also sharing some of the successes with Critical Chain. So I guess it's just it's probably a matter of time to get that traction and momentum going across the organisation.
And early on in the presentation, you mentioned that the projects that you and your team were managed were actually part of larger programs involving the final stage testing and the bringing to market of approved new pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
So, and I think in our discussions you were saying, well, sort of those milestones were concreted in because of the rest of the program. Now, had the rest of the program operated in a critical chain way, those would not be conventional fixed milestones. So, what about the interest from the broader new product introduction program, for want of a better term, of which you and your team are part of?
Yeah, limited at the moment. I guess one of the interesting developments we've seen is one of our previous site director who endorsed the pilot has now moved into the R&D organization and is managing a project, end-to-end project within R&D. That's a new product introduction project as well. And she's asked me to share the principles that we've applied on site with the wider R&D organization. So again, we're starting to have those conversations, Ian. But in terms of concrete implementation, as yet not. And I think, from our perspective, I guess it's building that reputation and building the success within the project delivery at Barnard Castle, and then hopefully we start to see people taking more interest in that and how that could potentially then help them outside of our site. But certainly there's a lot of conversation going on, both on other sites within the network, so some of our sister sites, in terms of discussions around, the success we've had with CCPM, but also, as I say, with our previous site director moving into R&D, there's some conversations now ongoing there as well, and sharing of the pilot that we've performed at Barnard Castle with the R&D organisation.
Okay, thank you. A question in from Amar relating to scope creep, things that were missing, errors addressed during the project. What sort of, well, I suppose there's two parts to that question. How were they handled? But also, how did using critical chain make a difference from others? Because the need to change scope and errors and mistakes is probably no different. Those are inherited project. But what impact do you think the critical chain method had on how you and the team coped with those sort of inherent uncertainties to scope of projects?
Yeah, I think you're right, Ian. I think development projects, it's inherent in development projects that you've got, potential for scope changes and changes to particular tasks and activities. I think what we've certainly found with CCPM is that rework cycle, that rework loop has been reduced significantly. So previously we'd see a change to a project, and because of the ways of working, often that would not be communicated to the full team effectively very quickly, and was at times a little bit like turning the Titanic, for want of a better phrase. It would be slow to respond, slow to react. I think because of the frequency of the weekly meeting process, so that Monday Friday meeting process, we've seen a number of benefits coming out of that, both in terms of sort of team engagement and collaboration and working relationships, but also communication flow and how fast communication moves now through the project team, and how quickly we can course correct, course adjust when changes come in, because they will come in, right? They just do. And you'll also, within any development project, you'll find, there's errors within tasks and activities, because somebody then works something out and think, oh, you know what, that was probably the wrong way of doing that. We need to do it differently. But that conversation and that rework cycle is very much reduced and shortened. And what we're finding is that our ability to react is much faster. And it's having, as a consequence, having a lot less impact on the overall project delivery.
Okay, so would you say that's similar to one of the common benefits people talk about with critical chain, is that sort of issues are tackled earlier and sooner, when they're smaller and easier to tackle?
Yeah, and I think it's what we found within critical chain. I think you do. A lot of people focus on the critical chain methodology and the aggregated buffer and the fever charts, and all of that gives you loads of benefit. It absolutely does. But what we found is that equally the benefit out of the increased cadence of the meetings, that focused Monday, Friday meeting process, almost the kind of agile principles, I guess, to a degree, of saying, look, this is your task list for this week. Have we got the resource aligned to it? Have we got all of the information we need, so full kitting in there? Do we need to do anything different, such as bringing people together in a room to collaborate more effectively? And then on the Friday, coming back together and saying, so have we been able to deliver that? And if not, how much longer do you need? And do you need any help? And what can we do to support you to do that as quickly as possible? So I think certainly those sort of key fundamentals of critical chain around aggregated buffers and fever charts, absolutely, it gives you a lot. But I guess we hadn't anticipated how much also that increased frequency of meeting together as a team on a Monday, Friday, and being really focused on the task list would give us. And I think it's that synergy between the two, really. I think it's a fundamental synergy between the principles that you apply to the planning process and the fever chart and what that gives you, but also that frequency of coming together as a team and collaborating and working more closely and being really focused on the task to deliver that week and making sure that people are being diligent about that delivery.
Okay, thank you. Just had another one crop in from Stephen, which we'll look to pick up before we draw to a close. Our session has been extended a couple of minutes, so we won't drop off in exactly 80 seconds, but I will close it in enough time for people to go and refresh their coffee cups or freshen themselves up, get some fresh air, so they don't miss the next session starting on the hour. Can you expand on how the culture shift for team members to begin this switch to a critical chain type of process was handled, and how will you roll this out to teams not caught in the initial wave? And I would add to that, how did people who were shared across different projects cope? So they were encouraged to work in one way on one set of projects, but on other projects, if they behaved in that way, they may not have got the same response. How did you tackle those things?
Yeah, interestingly, I'm doing a bit of a research, as you know, I'm doing a bit of a research project into critical chain at the moment. So we've been interviewing a number of the team members to understand some of their kind of views and perspectives on the introduction. And interestingly, not surprisingly, but the teams within the pilot already said, look, we work well as teams prior to the introduction of critical chain. We've been a new product introduction site for around about 30 years. We've got had a good operating model for delivery of NPI projects and work closely together. I think the fundamental shift was the shift in frequency and cadence of bringing people together, which I think again we hadn't necessarily anticipated that we'd start to see benefits in terms of increasing morale and motivation and collaboration from the team members just by actually bringing them together and being really clear about what they need to deliver and bringing them together to talk about the tasks that they've got to deliver that week and how they could help each other. And we're starting to see that kind of informal set of team building going on as we went through weeks of the pilot. So become much more collaborative, become much more problem solving in terms of a team instead of within their own silos. And I think we've started to see that growth, but absolutely, and I think this is a key point, Ian, is that we still have that conflicting tension with outside of CCPM in terms of the demands both within other projects outside of CCPM, but also the day-to-day workload and activities and priorities there. So we see some level of limitation on CCPM's benefits based on the fact that we are still at relatively small scale. So there is some discussion and dialogue going on at the moment with the senior leadership team as to how do we release the team to be more effective within that CCPM environment. So our site directors tasked us with looking at, so what alternatives, what options could we look at here between ring fencing of team members, scripting of team members' time during the week. How do we start to protect them from some of the noise within the day-to-day environment on a busy pharmaceutical site? So we're kind of working through that. It's definitely an issue and a problem that we need to solve. So we're not at the ideal state by any means yet. And I think you're right. I think that mental switching between CCPM and non-CCPM activities can create a tension that we certainly see within the teams. And I think that's the next step for us as to how do we then start to tackle that. And reduce that stress and anxiety for the folks who are involved both in teams, projects, and day to day.
Okay, thank you. Just 3 minutes left. We might sneak in a quick answer to a question from Norman about this sort of multifunctional meetings and the cadence that you method and the critical chain methodology. Mm-hmm. I see those as yin and yang. They go together extremely well. In that one supports the other and the other supports the one. How do you see it? And what things have you planned to sort of strengthen and reinforce that other than the critical chain method itself?
I think the planning and delivery, absolutely, the planning and delivery processes work very much hand in hand, and I think synergistically. And I think there's a key strand for me that runs from within the planning activity, and again, I think it's something that Andy was talking about earlier on, and Efrat was talking about this concept of focus. That I think one of the unintended consequences of doing the pilot was we became much more focused on ensuring that what was in the plan was accurate and correct, and then the implementation of that more accurate plan moves into a more frequent control and monitoring process that then drives the ability for people to go into that plan and interrogate it but within a sequenced plan. So rather than looking at the whole plan on an infrequent basis. You're looking at a segment or a sequence of that plan on a frequent basis, and then ensuring delivery. And I think it's just that kind of that integration, that close relationship between a much more diligent planning process and a much more frequent and intense monitoring and control process that gives the true benefit. And it takes effort. It's not without effort, but the effort really is worthwhile. So you start to see some significant benefits quite quickly. But I think nothing comes without that, without a bit of effort and a bit of focus. And I think that's exactly what we've had to do.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Simon, for sharing your experience, having some time online for us to record that chat and joining us here today and answering those questions.